It's common for vacuous neo-Marxist, Obama-supporting troglodytes to assert that we need higher taxes and more government spending now, especially since the economy has taken a nosedive. This way we can go back to the uber-successful big government expansions and high tax rates of the 1970s, which featured numerous recessions and job losses. And when it wasn't receding, we had stagnant growth. The questions liberals never ask, probably because they don't really know the answer but instead reach for talking points straight out of the donkey's butt, is this: how much have federal, state, and local spending and taxes increased over time? Federal, state, and local taxes and spending growth have typically outpaced inflation. Here are some facts and figures you can consider the next time you run into a libtard stumping for more government spending and higher taxes to cure a problem created by growing taxes and egregious spending. The U.S. average for state and local taxes in 2007 was 11%, up from 10.8% in 2006. The average combined state, local, and federal tab for 2007 was 32.7%. up from 32.3% in 2006 and 30.7% in 1980. Let's look at the recent trends in government spending in the states. According to Census Bureau data from 1996 to 2006, per capita total state government spending increased by 60%. That compared to inflation measured by changes in the GDP price deflator running at 24%. So you got 60% versus 24, way above the rate of inflation. Expand the scope to state and local government, and per capita total spending jumped by 58% from 1995 to 2005, and that compared to inflation of 23%. To sum up, per capita government spending in the states over the most recent decade's worth of data run at about 2.5 times the rate of inflation. Comparing the first 2 quarters of 2008 with the first 2 quarters of 2007, state and local tax revenues have grown about 2.1% over last year, with personal income taxes up 4.2% and property taxes up 4.3%. The author says about because he estimated the missing data item for corporate tax revenues. State and local total expenditures have soared 6.8% over last year. The gap between spending at about 7% and revenues at about 2% is curious, given that state governments are supposed to balance their budgets each year. The explanation, according to the Commerce data, is that state and local government borrowing is soaring, and just recently, the state's biggest source of income is the federal government. Great. So all this borrowing, let's say, being done in California, taxpayers in Idaho, Michigan, Alabama, well, you might as well write them thank you notes. State and local government spending has been rising 3 times as fast as revenue amid warnings from governors that their finances are nearing crisis stage. As many Americans face stagnant wages, high gas prices, and this was from summer of 2008, high gas prices and job uncertainty, new government figures show that state and local governments boosted spending 7.8% in the second quarter compared with 2007, while revenue rose 2.5%. So revenue was still up, but they spent 3 times as much. Their spending increase was 3 times as great. Government is on a hiring binge too, even as private sector jobs disappear. State and local governments are on track to spend more than $2 trillion for the first time in 2008, about 13% of the nation's gross domestic product. A key factor in driving higher spending, new employees and higher compensation. Yay, government is hiring. Government's always hiring. And wonder why education is always a recession-proof industry? Well, government controls it. We should hire a couple million more people to dig holes and a couple million more to come in behind them and fill those holes. Keynes would be so thrilled. State and local spending jumped 7.4% in the third quarter of 2008 compared with a year earlier, the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis reports. Hiring increased faster than in any sector except healthcare. Total state and local revenue grew just 2.6% in the third quarter. Sales tax collections fell 0.6%. Excuse me. as consumers cut spending. State and local governments added 160,000 workers in the past year, when the private sector cut 1.38 million jobs. The hiring continued in October. The federal government added 6,000 workers and state and local governments added 17,000, mostly in education, while businesses cut 263,000 jobs for a net loss of 240,000. Bush continued to pad government payrolls in such a manner that it would make Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson blush. State and local spending grew 34% from 2003 to 2007, while inflation was only 19% and population growth was 5%. So there we go. State and local spending grows 34%, inflation and population growth combined were only 24%. There's no cutting going on. So don't listen to the whiners that say, oh, we're cutting spending. No, we're not. Nobody's cutting anything. That's the problem. New York politicians are confronting an estimated $12 billion deficit. But New York's government has annual outlays that are $1,000 a year more per family than in the average state. New York would have a $5 billion surplus if it simply cut its spending rate to the 50-state norm. Granted, New York is one of the larger states, but if they cut a little bit, they wouldn't, they could have a $1 billion surplus instead of being $12 billion in the hole. Here's New Jersey. New Jersey has added some 58,000 employees to its public payrolls since 2001. For every new private sector job in the state, Trenton has added about 15 according to the U.S. Department of Labor. So one private sector job and they add 15 in the government. That's ridiculous. And now the coup de grace from Keith Hennessy. Looking at the share of federal taxes collected as a percentage of GDP from 1945 to 2005, the average is 18.1%, and there are some peaks and troughs, but it stayed at or near that average most of the time. The 30-year average is 18.4% when measured against GDP, so it's going up slowly. When one looks at total federal tax dollars collected from 1940 to 2008 in fiscal year $2,000, the government's take has markedly increased. There has been no starvation of the federal government concerning the number of tax dollars it has collected. None whatsoever. When you look at it in constant $2,000, it's skyrocketed. When one looks at state and local taxes as a percentage of GDP, there has been a steady increase in the last 60 years. Lastly, when one figures federal, state, and local taxes as a percentage of GDP, you can see a major increase. It was roughly 21% of GDP in 1950 and about 28% now. 7 cents more of each dollar earned are going to the government now than in 1950. And considering over a third of Americans have no income tax liability, you can see those at the top, that pyramid of those paying taxes, the base is getting awful small. It's getting smaller. The problem doesn't lie in too few taxes for a bevy of social programs. The problem is federal and especially state and local entities don't know how to cut spending when the economy is good. They've spent themselves into oblivion, and now that the tax revenue has somewhat dried up, many states are having major fiscal problems. The problem, my friends, is spending. Too many of our politicians on both sides of the aisle have learned to pander to numerous special interest groups, paying them back with massive government spending and taxes. Bush did this for 8 years, did nothing but spend, 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 and anybody who says he didn't is an idiot or a liar.